Everybody. So today on the show, I have a return guest. His name is Peter Moskos. He's a professor out of John Jay College Criminal Justice School. Peter is a very interesting individual. His knowledge on policing and the historical component of policing and crime is second to none. We touch on a number of topics today, everything from CompStat and broken windows and police leadership to mental health. And Peter's insights are definitely worth listening to. Furthermore, throughout the whole show, he cites a number of resources that I think would be beneficial for anyone looking to better educate themselves on why we are in the state of policing we're in right now. So with that, please enjoy the show. And if you ever have any comments, if you ever have any questions you want me to ask specifically, please just go to policinginamericapodcast.com. Look me up, put it on the YouTube channel, and I'll be more than happy to get those questions out there. Thank you so much for listening. Enjoy the podcast. Hi, everybody. Thank you again for tuning into the Policing in America podcast. I'm excited to have a return guest back on one of the most listened to podcasts I had in the past. And some of your emails and messages asked me to have him back. So I'm fortunate enough to do so. It's Professor Peter Moskos, professor out of the Department of Law, Police Science, and Criminal Justice Administration at John Jay College, Princeton, Harvard-trained sociologist. He did some time on the Baltimore City Police Department, where he helped do some cool dissertation work. And I know you got a lot of oars in the fire, sir. Anything particular you're working on that you want to share?
Well, something I've been working on for a long time, and thanks. Good to hear you, and it's nice to be back here. I am early next year. My next book will be out, and it's called "They Said It Couldn't Be Done" from University of California Press, and it is oral history of the crime drop in New York City in the 1990s. And there's a little. The first excerpt has appeared in public, which is thrilling for me to have some of this see the light of day because it's been a lot of work. But if people want to Google Vital City, which is a new public policy journal, Vital City and Moskos, Moskos, you can find it. But it's a short excerpt that looks at the redevelopment of Bryant Park and Port Authority bus terminal in Times Square in the 90s. And hopefully people will read it and say, wow, I want to read the rest of that book when it's finally out.
Absolutely. I know they will. I know that's going to be one of the first things I do when this podcast is done is check that out. And I think it's fairly appropriate that I launch into the podcast and tell me if I'm asking the question wrong or am I asking the wrong question maybe. But let's see if I can knock this out of the park here. So we seem to be seeing a large increase in crime, whether it's violent or property crime across the country, all types of states, all types of communities. And it appears as though we've tried running an experiment, which is a little bit of a hands-off approach on policing. And some people call it the Ferguson effect or whatever political term they may have. But in general, we're stepping back a little bit, stop, question, frisk is not there. Gun teams that we normally see are not out there, and for a variety of reasons. And I just wanted to ask you, do you think it's time to start relooking at this broken windows theory of policing and maybe get back on that, maybe that platform or maybe that approach to policing and crime?
I think it's important people understand what broken windows. I mean, the short answer, let me say, is yes. Okay, but from that, I think it's important people understand what broken windows is and isn't. And often it has been misconstrued initially by opponents of policing as a zero tolerance, lock them all up approach. And that is unfortunate because, so this comes from a 1982 Atlantic Magazine article by George Kelling and James Q. Wilson. And it was very much embraced by Bill Bratton when he was the chief of the New York City Transit Police in 91, and then later the commissioner of the New York Police Department twice. But I'm focusing primarily on the first time when New York saw, 50% reduction in murders in 3 years, and eventually it would drop more than 80%. So these were real. It happened first in New York. It happened most in New York, and Bratton worked with Kelling and is an open proponent of broken windows. So what does that mean? It means at a basic level, policing as a verb. It doesn't mean arresting people for everything. Ideally, you're not arresting people for misbehaving. You're changing behavior. You're policing behavior. You're setting standards of what is acceptable behavior. And to that extent, I mean, it seems sort of common sense. Now, it did morph into zero tolerance in New York 10, 15 years later when stop, question, and frisk went a little bit absurd starting around 2004. But that's after the main crime drop. So, broken windows, at some level, it's a basic problem-solving technique. And it's not a silver bullet solution. You don't just do broken windows. You have to figure out, well, what are the problems? What makes people afraid? Who are the criminals? Where are they operating? What's their MO? So you got to take all those things into account. George Kelly, who passed away a few years ago, said, to some extent, it just gave it gave police the justification to police the way the public always wanted them to, because previously, and this really goes back, I think, to the Kerner Commission in the late 60s after riots, academia bought the myth that you have to look at the root causes of crime to prevent crime. And to some extent, police departments, so they didn't buy it, that theory, they were happy to say, hey, crime is up. It's not our fault. Fix society. In New York in the 90s, society was not fixed. There were no major improvements in any of those social economic indicators. In fact, poverty went up during the decade. What's also interesting in New York, and this is not true for the rest of the nation, in New York, incarceration actually went down in that decade. There was an increase in arrests, but the jail population decreased during this time, and then a few years later, the prison population started to go down as well. And that's important to keep in mind, that you can reduce crime and also reduce incarceration at the same time. But recently, as you said, we seem to be doing this new experiment, and it's hard to pinpoint exactly what the problem is because of, 36 things have happened. But clearly, it's not working in its collective entity. And that should be pretty obvious now, 2 years after the huge increase in violence in 2020.
Is there any basis in from an academic perspective of the idea that COVID was a main driver of this increase in crime, and now we're just seeing the echoes of despair, say with COVID?
I mean, no one can say COVID didn't matter. Of course it mattered. It was, it's a global pandemic. But the frustrating part for me is, again, being now professor for almost 20 years, people just want to pretend policing doesn't matter. And that's a weird foundational position. So they're, in a way, grasping for straws. Crime did not go up dramatically when COVID hit. Crime has not gone up anywhere else in the world because of COVID, including Mexico and Canada. We are unique. Now, you could argue that we have other unique factors, guns come to mind, that combine with COVID maybe. But look, violence went up after the protests and unrest after George Floyd was murdered. That was the proximate factor. Now, you have to dig a little bit deeper, but this still isn't complicated. It's not the George Floyd, protests did not suddenly cause people to start shooting each other everywhere. What happened is it changed policing. And this you can show with, this is not an opinion. You can just look at proxies for policing, things like arrests and stops. And I'm always a little hesitant because this is how broken windows morphed into zero tolerance. You don't want to just look at those numbers and say, do more of it. Because boy, cops, if you want cops to lock people up, it's easy. The question is, are you locking up the right people? But clearly policing changed. Clearly there have been many Ferguson-like effects, and that's, again, you have to define that. I'm not just talking about what happened in Ferguson. I'm talking about specific incidents. New York City is where I live and what I know best, but there were specific incidents from the unrest to the so-called diaphragm law, which was a idiotic move by the city council. It did two things. One of them was redundant, and the other is borderline unconstitutional, but the latest is it does pass muster. But it was a ban on chokeholds, which were already banned by the state, so that was redundant. And then it also criminalized putting pressure on the diaphragm in the course of an arrest. It makes no sense. At the time, they said, oh, we'll change it. Of course, they didn't, because the people who want that in there wanted that in there. They don't want policing, and they're it is death by 1,000 cuts. But for cops, that was a huge deal because any stop that goes wrong that leads to an arrest, potentially, you could be criminally charged with a misdemeanor for violating the diaphragm part of that law. Why would be a question. But anyway, so these were events, and you can look at decreased police activity. And the jump from that to more violence is a little harder to definitively prove. But at some point, you have to Occam's razor this and go, look, here, this is the obvious thing. What does it mean? I mean, to say that, and yes, the protests were related to COVID, so it's not that that doesn't matter. But you have to get into you can't just say this causes crime. Well, what does it mean? How does this relate either to more people or fewer people shooting each other? It's always in the details there. And that, of course, requires organizational leadership. And I mean, one of the things I looked at in the crime drop in the 90s, because a lot of people say, well, Bratton did it, or Giuliani did it, or it was Comstat. There's some truth to all of that. But what does that mean? Comstat doesn't reduce violence. You have to go a step further and say, oh, it's a system of accountability. Suddenly, precinct commanders now actually are in charge of their precinct and held responsible for crime trends. And then then the hard part is, okay, well, what are the tactics? What are the methods? So you have to get down to that level, but it all starts with good leadership that says, this is our role. And when Bratton came on in 94, he very quickly said, the mission of the NYPD is to reduce crime, fear of crime, and disorder. And we'll go from there. And then he promised a 10% reduction in violent crime the first year, which was really radical at the time for police commissioners to say, judge me on crime. And he passed that with flying colors. And that was literally thousands of lives were saved.
Excellent. Thank you for that, because you're bringing up so many good points. And I'm going to ask you, how do you think Comstat intersects with this idea of broken windows theory? From my perspective, it was one of the things that dragged it down. But I just wanted, if you know a lot about this, so your thoughts.
So what happened, and I guess if I can't get nitty gritty and into the weeds here, where can I? But stop me if I start rambling.
Sure.
But so Jack Maple, who was Bratton's right-hand man, and they worked together in the transit police. So these police departments, the transit housing and NYPD, merged in, I could be off by a year, 95, but I'm pretty sure it was 95. Before that, there was 3 separate departments. So it can get a little confusing there. But Maple came on and said, we're not focused on crime. We're focused on reducing corruption. We're focused on scandal avoidance. And I want to so how many people were shot last year in New York City? It seems like a basic question. Nobody was keeping track. So Bratton got that number, and it was, Maple got that number. I'm sorry. It was something like, 5,600 and something. And if you look now, we only have accurate shooting data going back to 1993, the year, that they started counting, or really it was the year before they were there, but that's what they look back the previous year. So how can if you're not even counting the number of shootings, how could you possibly expect to bring that down? Mm-hmm. So what Comstat did was send a message to the entire police department that these are our priorities. And those meetings were run. Bratton takes a back seat in that, which is interesting. He went there to see what was going on. He went there to judge performances, see who might be good for promotion. But it was Lou Anemone and Jack Maple who were running those meetings. And the questions they were asking were so basic to some extent. Well, when are these burglaries happening? Do you see a pattern? It was really policing 101, but there had been no incentives to do that until that point. Mm-hmm. That's great. You made 3 arrests for robberies. Well, are the robberies going down? And if the answer is no, well, then are you arresting the right people? Like, keep at it. The goal is not arrest. The goal is to reduce the crime, and arrests are a tool for that. And though broken windows was a major part of it, and quality of life matters a lot just for its own sake, but the basic crux of the crime reduction, I don't think, was directly broken windows. It was proactive policing. It was a more aggressive approach. They like to use the word assertive, I think, because aggressive sounds a bit too harsh. But there were also, the feds were taking down major gangs at the same time and using conspiracy laws and so on. They got other city agencies into the act. So it was a shift away from what was officially considered community policing because that was big under, started with Benjamin Ward as commissioner and was big under Mayor Dinkins. And let's also not forget that under Mayor Dinkins, Safe Street, Safe City got passed in late 91, early 92, and that hired 5,000 cops over 3 years. So Bratton walked into a situation in which crime had been declining a little bit, sort of post-crack epidemic, but he also walked into a much larger police department, and that wasn't being managed very well until then. But so he had a lot of resources at his disposal when he took over.
So this is, and tell me what you think of this. Thank you for that, by the way. The CompStat model, I think if you understand it, sure, accountability and are we doing the right things? But what I saw was sort of that Goodhart's law observation when the metric then became the goal. Arrests were just supposed to be one metric. But like you said, if arrests are up, but the robberies or burglaries aren't moving, well, then these arrests are pointless. But it seemed like the good cop, the proactive cop made arrests. Bottom line. And it didn't look any further if this was prosecuted. Did they file on this person? Didn't matter. You're a good cop because you make arrests. And it's sort of, we
it
missed
requires constant leadership. And I think that broke down. Look, you had two mediocre, let's just say uninspiring police commissioners after Bratton and Howard Safer and Bernie Carrick, one of whom was convicted. Then Ray Kelly came back for a long time under Bloomberg, and he was a different kind of leader, but there were fewer new ideas. He was more of a micromanager. He accomplished a lot, and I don't want to group him with Carrick or Safer because Ray Kelly is a better person and police commissioner. But the ideas ran out. It became a more top-down organization, and look, if crime is going up, yeah, then they start using arrests again. We're doing something. But so it really does require that constant vigilance to say we're not focused on the numbers. We're using the numbers because how else are we going to measure things?
Right.
But the key is we want to focus on crime. We want to focus on victims. And yeah, over the years, they lost that focus. Many people I interviewed, I don't know, 30 or 35 people from my book, along with, many other connections, but formal interviews, recorded interviews. And they said, and just to, if your listeners are interested, really, it's not just, I don't care if people listen to my podcast, but there's a great interview I have. It's at qualitypolicing.com. A lot of the people I talk about, you can see there, but there are two in particular, Billy Gorta and John Yo, who were the lower level tech people behind CompStat. And they're good storytellers. They're smart guys. And they sort of talk about those early formative years. There's if there are other systems of accountability, it could be argued that CompStat didn't have to continue. Different times require different methods of policing. I think undoubtedly when there were over 2,000 murders in New York City, policing needed to take a more aggressive approach. As crime went down, you would change accordingly. And I don't know if that change happened is the problem. And as crime got lower and lower, there was just this fear to not be the precinct commander that screwed it all up. So you kept squeezing the juice out of that CompStat, and there wasn't much juice left in there anymore.
Right.
And it kind of turned into a disaster in recent years.
Is it, as sad as this is to say with human nature, the idea of zero crime is, I mean, sure, it's the goal, but is it reasonable to say, well, now murders are at 0%? I mean, you're always going to get, but right. Go ahead.
I don't like unachievable goals. I think it's bad to say we're going to bring crime down to zero because you're going to fail at that.
Right.
That said, when there were 2,200 murders in New York City, even these, I would say, visionary leaders of the NYPD, people like Timoney, Maple, Animo, and Bratton, they were amazed at how much crime went down. They were amazed at their own success. And if you had told them that they could reduce murders 50%, as Jack Maple said, they're going to build statues of us in prisons, and they're going to build statues of us, and pigeons will be crapping on our head. But so the idea that you could end up you could go down over to fewer than 300 murders in an American city of more than 8 million. no one could have predicted that. And so maybe there is something we say we're just going to keep bringing it down. But at some point at that level, I think, when New York City has fewer murders than Baltimore, which is, fewer than 600,000 people, at some point you might go, okay, let's just try and keep it where it is. Whatever we're doing is working.
Yeah.
All the numbers are going in the right direction. Let's not do anything crazy. But that's the exact point when people decided the whole system was broken and needed to be defunded and restarted. And
So with that, and I've seen this now at multiple agencies, and I'm in contact with some in Seattle and in Portland. And when you talk to these officers and you look at their policies and you hear their mayors, like these are progressive police departments. These are they have instituted some incredible policies on procedural justice and implicit bias, de-escalation. All the 8 can't wait model is in all these, and they can't win. They just can't convince people that they are not here to just systemically oppress one particular cohort or group.
yeah,
How do they do what is the next move for agencies like this? They can't retain officers, they can't get officers, and so everything's just falling apart slowly.
I think good police leadership needs to push back a little bit more. There is
Yeah.
good faith criticism and there's bad faith criticism. And I think we've been listening and responding to bad faith criticism. And here's my litmus test. And, some of this is just based on spending too much time on Twitter. But it's one thing to complain about bad policing, but I see more and more people complaining about good policing.
Ah.
And it's because they don't like policing. Well, if your goal is police abolition, I will respectfully disagree with that. But then you don't get a seat at the table, at least not at my table. Your vision is bad and it's unrealistic and it's unpopular. If you want to improve policing, that's fine. But I unfortunately think a certain amount of critics want to make policing worse because that will lead to, I don't know, to for more people to see the horrors of oppressive policing in some utopian world that they dream of that isn't going to happen. There's really, especially now, no other way to, I think, to look at defund. And of course, that's lost some of its luster, luckily, but it's still out there. You don't defund organizations to make them better. So why do you want to make it worse? That's what they should be asked. We're trying to make things better here, and we're not always right, and mistakes are made. But if your goal is to make policing worse, then we're not going to listen to you. It's bad faith criticism.
I appreciate that. And there's two things I want to push on that. One is you use a word that I use. I always push back against this idea of police reform. Why can't we say police improvement or the betterment of policing? It's the same thing in the medical. We don't say we're going to reform surgery. We're going to make surgeries better. And I understand that there are problems in policing, but I don't think we need to start over. We need to recalibrate in the air. How do you feel about that word reform? Is it benign to you? Because for me, it feels that the officers push back against it as opposed to police improvement.
I cringe when I hear words that it's basically impossible to be against. I also kind of put community policing in that category. Lots of good can come from it in theory, but what does it mean? And is anyone willing to say I'm against community policing? No, but that makes it almost meaningless. Oh, I'm, reform. I think his name was Patty Baller, an old Chicago politician from 100 years ago, who said, this city ain't ready for reform. And he was talking about the Goo-Goos and the progressives of his time. And of course, history has not judged him kindly, but yeah, reform. What about when it doesn't work? What about when it makes things worse? Yeah, improvement is the goal. And if you just say change is good for its own sake, no, I'm not willing to accept that. I want to see improvement. Now, of course, when people use the word reform, they mean improvement, but then why not use the word improvement? So basically, every new police commissioner has to say they're a reformer, whether they are or not. And a lot of that leads to change for change's sake. And, then you get bounce, they were there for a couple years, declare victory and move on, even though things got worse. So, yeah, I'm skeptical of this idea of just we want to reform. Well, yeah, what do you want to reform? Why? And how are you going to do it? The devil is in the details there.
Well, that's good for me because when I say it, I'm going to pull you out of my back pocket and say, well, this guy agrees with me. With that idea of they want to make we want to make policing better, not worse. We are now across the board lowering the standards of policing. And I don't mean character, I mean education. We should be moving, if we want to professionalize this industry the way we professionalize engineers and accountants and doctors and lawyers, professors, we mandate a certain curriculum, a certain education level. And in policing, we're taking that away. And I thought we were going in the right direction, asking for at least a 4-year degree to be able to cognitively think, maybe get somebody a little bit older onto the job, a little more life experience, a little more patience, a little more tolerance. And because of all the reforms, I feel like we're just now having to take whoever will do this job. Any thoughts on that?
I worry, we'll see what happens. With Baltimore as an exception with the gun trace task force, and even that now is somewhat in the past. There have been a lot fewer major corruption scandals. And, in the academic world, you can never prove anything. But I think some of that has to be because of higher standards. You lower standards and you're going to have issues down the road. It's not guaranteed. And, you don't necessarily. When I was a cop many years ago, there was no college requirement, and I worked with a lot of great cops. But I do think college makes you a better person, which probably makes you a better cop. It also makes you a bit older, which I think is better going on the job. And I learned something interesting in one of the interviews I did. When New York implemented a college requirement, it's 2 years. Very few departments have 4 years, and most have none at all still. But part of the reason they did that wasn't so much for the college, but they noticed after the corruption scandal, I'm thinking Mike O'Dowd in that area. This is in Brooklyn in the 7-5 precinct. And there were a bunch of scandals, the Dirty 30. And they went back and looked for red flags. Like, did we miss something in the hiring? And the problem was they basically had no background because they lived with their parents. They didn't really have work experience. They didn't really have school experience. So part of the idea about requiring a college was simply to get something on the record so we can look at it. And I hadn't thought of that before. And so, the military could serve that purpose, college could serve that purpose, and work could. But just because someone doesn't have obvious red flags might not be good enough. And that can happen if there are fewer requirements. So that's something to think about.
Yeah. And just when I had this conversation, because there's a lot of good people, like you saying, there's a lot of the autodidact people that educate themselves. They don't have to go to the university. You can listen to Princeton lectures online at this point. So I understand that, but it's just
Can I tell one story about that?
Please, I would love it.
I'll even say his name because he was a good guy. Sergeant Peel was a sergeant in the Baltimore's Eastern District. Those from Baltimore may remember him. He was a bit of a character. And he goes, Moskos, tell me about some of those Harvard professors. I'm thinking, who the hell is this guy? He could barely keep his shirt tucked in. Bless his soul. And I didn't know what to tell him. So I people didn't even know what sociology was often. But I say, well, my advisor is this guy named Orlando Patterson. And he goes, oh, Jesus, he wrote that great book on slavery. I'm thinking, yeah. And you know what? You've read it and I haven't.
Oh, my gosh.
So there's so many smart people in the police department and people who just like learning for their own sake. Often, I think more so than other fields because of the certain opportunities people had in class backgrounds where they did not get pushed into college like I was. But they're certainly smart and intellectual. Anyway, go on. I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate you sharing because I want to acknowledge that, and I feel as though just anecdotally, when people hear my stance, I'll get written off as, oh, it's an academic in policing, but then they get to know me and they realize I did some street time. So all of a sudden I have some credibility, but there is this hard line with academics. And we need to expose academia to people like yourself and Dorothy Schultz and Professor Lois James and all these people who are academics, but also are in policing and really just want to make the profession better. But with that, so better, not worse, Sergeant Peel. So I want to ask you, I'm taking a little bit of a hard right here. So a lot of things coalesce to put us in the position we're in. You mentioned the myth about addressing the root cause. And that seems to be a very famous phrase right now across the board. Do you have any, can you expand on that a little bit more on what you meant by it? The root cause of crime.
Yeah, theory is going to be the downfall of us at some point. So to kind of briefly explaining, the root causes says that crime is caused, which is in the field that says that never wants to give causation to anything, by
Right.
racism, poverty, unemployment, social and economic conditions. Um, and those things are undoubtedly important, and perhaps even more important than policing, but it's not my professional field. But the idea that we have to wait for society to fix these things, which may never be fixed, before we can focus on violent criminals it's an injustice to nonviolent people living out there. And also,
Mm.
time and time again, we see examples. And I mentioned in New York how poverty went up and violence plummeted. Uh, they're not correlated, these things, at least not directly, maybe in the long run. So we need to disaggregate. People love talking about holistic solutions. Well, often when you start thinking holistically, it means you don't do anything concretely. Um, and again, I really want to stress I'm not against fixing those root causes, but they're not violence prevention programs. If you want to prevent violence, focus on violence. Um, and if people talk about after school programs. Great. I love after school programs. I'm willing to spend more money on them. But in New York, and I think it's gone down a little bit recently, but the average shooter was 29 years old. An
Mm.
after school program is not going to stop him from shooting somebody.
Right.
And again, if you're looking for long-term solutions, go ahead and do that. But in the meantime, while you're doing that, can we focus on actual criminals and crime? And so that's one of the things. Also talking about what we need from police leadership. Um, and to switch slightly, we can get back to root causes if you want, but there needs to be more defense of good policing when it becomes a controversial viral video. I used to joke, and now I'm not joking. You used to have to mess up to get in trouble as a cop, and I see
Right.
more and more examples of cops policing well, how they were trained, how it's necessary, using force, and getting in trouble for that. And that needs to be pushed back upon when cops shoot an armed person who's in the process of stabbing someone. And in that case, I think the chief may have defended it. But this is when you have to know your criticism, again, is bad faith criticism. This is why we have cops, to police this way.
Yeah.
The kid in Chicago who was shot, Adam Toledo was his name, literally as the gun was falling from his hand, and then people say he was unarmed. And it's like, no, come on now. The guy had
Right.
just shot a gun and was holding it. There's something called reaction time, and so you got to take that 0.2 of a second into account. Anyway, but just because something is controversial and it's easier to say, oh, we're doing an investigation, you have to draw a line in the sand somewhere sometimes. And when the police did behave correctly, and say, no, this is we can talk about this if you want, but this should not be considered an example of bad or controversial policing, as ugly as it may look.
That's going to be a soundbite that many officers are gonna cling to, because it is absolutely true. I'm the first one to criticize the profession or perhaps an individual action, but the blanket, the confirmation bias for trying to find this action to justify that belief, completely
and people
skewed.
talk about police immunity and the blue wall of silence. At least in my world, straddling policing and academia, I hear a lot of criticism of policing from police officers, private and public, certainly more in private even, but in public, we criticize bad policing all the time. And I am still waiting for one advocate of the various reforms that have been done to the criminal justice system in the past 5 years to simply be self-reflective.
Yeah.
There's a recent thing where New York passed raise the age, and the data shows that 16-year-olds are now much more likely to recidivate and commit more crimes. What that then means or implies, people who are into raise the age can debate that, but they're not. They're silent.
Mm-hmm.
There's no criticism of the reform movement when it doesn't go well. And usually it's just, we're in a hole, keep digging. Oh, well, it's a longer term project. No, at some point you got to focus on the short term, the here and now. And conveniently with policing and violent crime, you can do that. We've seen time and time again. When violence did go up 2 years ago, largest increase in American history, it happened like in a month. It was not a long-term trend. At the time, now, yes, COVID was in effect. At the time, unemployment was going down because the COVID had already, it was a couple months into COVID. Like, again, these root causes that people love focusing on, it's just, there's no there when it comes to what cops have to do on the street.
Yeah, you hear somebody say crime is up because people are shoplifting bread to feed family, and nobody wants to address the fact that we have a pretty robust food stamp program, and we have, there's people in major cities. I'm a product of this. Starvation wasn't the issue. We had food stamps. Now maybe opportunity or those sorts of things to get out of your situation were not as prominent, but starving, it's not. This isn't necessarily an issue, but and that doesn't certainly correlate to drive-by gang violence or kids getting shot because they're shoplifting bread.
Yeah, there's also something slippery when you try and focus on something. You go, well, maybe parts of bail reform in New York State didn't work. And then they say, well, it clearly wasn't bail reform because of this. Okay, well, maybe those other things didn't. Like, the point is, there have been a lot of changes. It's not a
Mm-hmm.
single issue. And a lot of people use bail reform for shorthand, with sort of saying all these policies. But it's a very slippery thing to try and get someone to say, can we really talk about the issues and which of these worked and which of these didn't? Like, if we're concerned about shoplifting, okay, well, are there organized gangs doing massive retail theft? And the answer, of course, is yes. That's not all the shoplifting, but then can we
Mm-hmm.
focus on that? It's not an honest debate we're having, unfortunately. But at least I
It's
think the pendulum is swinging in the right direction with the recall in San Francisco and Eric Adams being elected in New York. At some point, people are, there's only so long you can tell people don't believe your lying eyes about what's going on. And the figuring out the exact source of the problem is tougher. But we have to put on our thinking caps and do that.
Well, and you nailed a few things that are coming together. So the idea of the no bail or the bail reform, that was a true reform. It just sort of stopped. So officers will arrest people and they are out. And when they're sitting being processed, I've heard this from hundreds, not dozens, hundreds of officers who say they are literally laughing, saying, you guys are going to be still working on this and you're going to be stuck at the station and I'm going to be back out. What a waste of time. And that is a little bit demeaning, degrading, certainly demotivating for the officers who say it's true because they'll get a radio call 6 hours later saying that person that they just arrested is back and they
Yeah.
don't know what to do. And these issues, I think, are now sort of tacitly getting into officers' minds saying, what is the point of all this?
Well, and
All
also
I'm
the
doing is taking,
prosecution, which is a
go ahead.
separate factor. I mean, there are different parts of the system. Prosecution plays a role. It doesn't matter what the bail is if someone won't be prosecuted for these offenses. The recent sort of trend, at least in more liberal cities, to not focus on illegal gun possession, I think is a literally a fatal and figuratively a fatal flaw in the system. There is some low hanging fruit here. Like, can't we agree that people, should follow the gun laws we have of their jurisdiction? Apparently, it's not so easy to say that anymore.
Mm,
Now, by the way, cops have been saying forever that people have been released before they finish the paperwork, but I think there's more truth to it now, and the crimes
mhm.
that happens for are more serious. And you mentioned one thing that I think is important to highlight. People call and say the person is back. Um, that a lot of people pushing these reforms live in neighborhoods and blocks where crime is not a big problem, and they don't. Either they think the whole community is made up of criminals or people being criminalized by the police, and they don't understand. No, most people are just trying to get their kids to school, and go to work every day.
Right.
When that criminal that got arrested returns, it has a horrible effect on the people who live there. Not just because of the actions of that person, but think of things like witness intimidation. And you don't need that much of it for it to be real. We're talking about people's neighbors. And let's take something like burglary, just to not make it super violent. But your house gets burglarized, and you know who did it, and that person and you see that person every day.
Yeah.
And then they say, well, and then will you testify against that person? Well, that person has some violent friends. These things matter. And also, the victim wonders what's the point of all this if the person isn't detained. Yeah, I think we need more jail and less prison, as one of the shorthand things I say. It's sometimes that, a night in jail ends up being the punishment. I know that's not the way the system is supposed to work in the ideal theoretical world, but that's the way it did work. You do something bad, you go to jail for the night or for the weekend. So that's not happening anymore. the idea that there need to be consequences. I don't think that should be such a radical. They don't have to destroy people's lives. They don't have to be of incredible severity. But just that simple concept: you do something bad, you get you get some punishment. Um, it's both, I think, the morally correct thing, and politically, I think it's of course essential to win over the support of the public in any of your policy reforms. But look, I'm politically in that small Venn diagram of a pro policing liberal. But what worries me coming from the political left is if we don't have answers to these questions, we are going to get an extreme backlash that probably will not be productive. That will simply, I don't think we need longer sentences. I think we need more people who are guilty convicted and being sentenced. And again, things were moving in the right direction for 10, 15 years until recently. So we have a template that was working. But I don't know I don't know where we're going to go from here.
Now, that is something I would love to sink my teeth into. And I had Professor Barry Latzer on not too long ago talking about all this. And I thought, if we want to reform something, let's reform the concept of jail and prison and make it more than just punishment. Okay, so you're being punished, I guess, paying for your sins, if you will, but let's try to address something. So why are you in this life? Can we give people skills? Can we teach them something? Can we make them mechanics and welders or even educators? Like, I just feel the idea of crime, punishment, and then we put them back into society and we brand them as a scarlet letter saying, well, you're a felon. You can't really do anything else anymore. So I feel like we can reform that idea. Has that ever...
Well, use the word reform again.
I know. I did.
A couple books ago, I wrote In Defense of Flogging, talking about the prison system. To some extent, I don't want to I'm not against programming in prison, not at all. But I also think we have to be realistic about it. And perhaps those skills are best taught in a non-prison environment. And maybe we should just accept the fact that prison is punishment and stop the nonsense that somehow it's going to make people better. Because it does sometimes. It rarely does. We've been at the penitentiary system now for 200 years, and it doesn't work as a reformatory system. And it never has. So I think, and look, it doesn't mean that prisons should be cruel. I think the punishment is being in prison.
Right.
That's the punishment. It's not about what happens in prison that should be the punishment. So there should be programming. Yes, there should be skills. But this idea that people commit crimes sometimes, because they want to. Like, it's not, I don't know what we reform them to. Yes, we have to give them better choices so they don't. But it's not like, by and large, they're sick individuals who just need to see the progressive shining light of what we consider our proper values. People take drugs because they like it. People sell drugs because it makes money. There's one giant thing, though, that needs to be addressed, which is mental health. And as we don't give people mental health, too many of our prisoners suffer from severe mental health problems, which makes prisons miserable for other inmates and correctional officers. Prisons, you give what treatment you can for that, but what could be a worse kind of mental health retreat than a maximum security prison? That's something we need to address on the front end, but we refuse to do that as well. So we wait for people in crisis to commit crimes and then lock them up because we won't treat them or commit them when they clearly need help. And I'm talking about visibly mentally ill, homeless people in cities. The idea that that's a choice and we just wait for them to do something bad. And of course, not all of them do something bad, but many do. That is a flaw. And I don't, and I'm not a mental health expert, but I think we have to re-examine our commitment laws. We have approximately half the number of inpatient beds for mental health treatment that Europe does, that experts say is needed. So why don't we start with doubling that and getting up to what people say is needed, and then we can readdress the situation. But we basically ignore mental health, and especially when it's combined with addiction, and that often is exacerbated by or can lead to being homeless and all those situations. But in terms of prisons, I'm kind of just say, yes, you did something bad, you get punished. Now, we should teach skills. We could teach it before or after prison as well. I don't know. I mean, I don't, we're here to talk about these things. I think it's always important to remember what we don't know. But once you start into this idea that people just need to be reformed, well, we haven't achieved that yet. So yeah, as I said, I think we should have actually shorter sentences because it is less destructive, but still is punishment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and maybe start from that point. But people need services. The former commissioner of probation and parole in New York City, Marty Horn. A lot of these people you mentioned, by the way, Barry Latzer, Dorothy Schultz, they're my colleagues. They're both
Yeah.
emeritus now. But Marty Horn said at some point he thinks it might be better if we just abolish the parole system. And because it's not working, because people think it's this magic solution. Now, the big thing is supervised release. Well, they're not being supervised. If we were actually to supervise people, but that's a system that's supposed to provide services. It may even be effective. I'm skeptical, but I don't want to be too critical of something like that. But he said the problem is, and the reason we can't use some sort of where's that famous nice prison that everyone talks about in Scandinavia? I forget which country.
Oh, yes.
Norway.
I forget too.
I think it's Norway. But he said the issue isn't the prison. The problem is people go back to the same crappy life situation they started with. It's that we don't have a social safety net in society. So in a way, we're putting too much responsibility on the prison. But what happens when people get out? So I would prefer to see more attention on helping people who are willing to accept help after they're released than in the idea that they can be cured in prison. But this is getting a little bit out of my lane. I prefer to focus on policing, but these are important issues because they do all tie together.
Well, absolutely. The one you're talking about, it's the Bastøy prison in Norway. The Bastøy prison, which is
people also have to remember it's not a normal, like you have to be on your best behavior to get in there in the first place. So it's a self-selective group that goes there. But even the normal prison in those countries are better than we have here.
Well, I was going to say, sir, and this is how I think this coalesces, because officers tend to deal with a lot of the repeat offenders. It is the rare occurrence. They get termed the unicorn when an officer has somebody processing for booking and they run their rap sheet and there's nothing, and it's a blank sheet. They'll walk around talking to people like never, no rap sheet. Nothing.
I literally never arrested anybody for the first time.
Exactly.
Literally.
Right?
I mean, I know there must be a first time. I never did it. And I mean, I wasn't there for that long, so that's part of it, but never.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about 13-year-old, robbers too in this category.
Yes. So that's why I think it has so much to do with policing, because it is so rare that we ever get somebody that it's usually a DUI, and it's a minor DUI at best where you get this. But in general, for the violent type crimes, it just seems like the process of this whole criminal justice system. Now, there's an officer who makes the statement, failed public policies fall at the doorstep of policing. So it just seems like all the things surrounding the criminal justice system fall at our doorstep. The idea, like you said, of mental health and addiction. This is 70% of the radio call volumes that officers are getting. And they're not trained for this. They're completely out of their depth. And they show up having to handle crimes, trying to give commands or trying to ascertain information from people who are truly suffering from mental health crises, and they can't formulate thoughts, and they're in crises, and they're not able to articulate, and they get sometimes violent just because they're agitated or frustrated or under the influence. So I agree with you. I want to talk about policing, but it also feels like these things are all pushing and pulling on the profession in ways that we're not addressing.
And, people talk about, okay, maybe police shouldn't be responding to some of these calls. You know who would love not responding to those calls is police. But first of all, given the prevalence of guns and the violent behavior of some, social workers aren't going to respond to these calls alone. So that would cost a lot of money. I'm not 100% convinced that every social worker is going to handle this better than a cop. Cops learn a lot from experience and have a lot more empathy than I think a lot of outsiders realize. Not all cops, but most. And the other thing is, what is this magic pixie dust that social workers have where things get magically de-escalated and so on? Like, things go wrong. We have police because they may legally use force and to some extent are legally permitted to make good faith mistakes that the public wouldn't be. So, there's a program in Denver where but they're working 9 to 5. Like either let's really fund these things completely and properly. But again, what do you do with someone who has a weapon? There's a limit to how it does cost money. I don't know if the benefit from these programs is worth the outlay. It might be, and I'm willing to spend more money, but I don't think we're going to see these magic solutions, because at this point, once somebody is in crisis, we're already too late. We have not addressed the problem. So whoever responds to it, to the 911 call, and we should see that as already the system failing, and not the start of how we judge the response.
What I'm gathering is the police management. I have a hard time saying leadership these days. It's just so hard because it just feels like they're managing things, as opposed to I thought William Bratton was, a true police leader, and he stepped out there and he took the microphone and he sort of embraced that role. But it appears as though when you have officers saying that's not worth the risk of me becoming a viral video because the department or the bureau is not going to support me on this. Go ahead.
That's when cops, people talk about supporting police. Like, no, we're not talking about supporting bad cops. We're talking about that cop who saw someone suspicious in an alley, and today is not going to stop that person because something may go wrong. That's a chance. But a couple of years ago, they would have taken that risk, and we want them to take that risk. Well, first we have to decide that we want them. We, as political leaders in society, have to say, yes, we do want you stopping people legally and constitutionally based on reasonable suspicion. So that's the first step. But then, you need leaders who are willing to back that up. And I don't know what to tell cops today, because there is a risk of something goes wrong. It's hard to get someone in cuffs. And everyone who's put someone in cuffs knows that. I mean, if the person's resisting, it's easy if they comply. Sure. So man, I don't want to be so pessimistic. I just don't know what the solution is now, because the necessary conditions for improvement are not there at this moment, and are still, because of recruitment issues and decreased police proactive policing, are still not really trending in the right direction.
Well, and you have very vocal district attorneys saying we are not going to prosecute these type of crimes. And when one of those is resisting arrest, you now incentivize, well, what the heck? I might as well try to resist and get out of this. And
did they ever prosecute that? But sometimes they did. But it was
sure. But
to say you won't is very different. To state that as policy. Often, by the way, it's resisting arrest when no other crime is committed, which is a different category. But this whole idea of decriminalization at the prosecutorial level is worrisome, because even shoplifting, it's not like minor shoplifters were going to prison. But there is a general deterrence that you might get in trouble for it. People, at least in the left, talk about right-wing overreaction to crime, but there's also left-wing overreaction. Like with 3 strikes and you're outlaw, there were some cases where, I don't think morally we can defend locking people up forever because of that third felony. A few cases. There was Khalif Browder, who died and, committed suicide after being in Rikers for years, because he was probably innocent, but, he was accused of stealing a backpack, and he wanted a trial, and he got lost in the system. And that led to a lot of this recent reform. If it weren't for those cases and those, if we didn't have 3 strikes and you're out, then maybe we could have 12 strikes and you're out. At some point, and this is it's one thing to say give someone a second and even third and fourth chance, but you look at people who have, been arrested 12 times this year, God knows how many times they got away with it, and have, 50 arrests in their lifetime. At some point you have to say enough already.
Right.
So, I mean, is anyone really against 40 strikes and you're out? I don't know. Maybe some people probably would be. But there is this sort of extremism on both sides that is not healthy for public policy, to put it mildly.
Is there, in your view, can we go about starting to repair this idea of policing without it being political? Or is this forever? It feels as though policing is now interwoven for political gain.
I think it always has been and always will be. And we can talk about making it less political, and it's probably good. But I think we have to see policing as part of the political system. I don't think it's ever been otherwise. And keep in mind, one extreme that comes where it sort of wasn't was was Daryl Gates and the riots in L.A. in '92 when the city said, "Boy, you really screwed this up. We'd like you to quit," and it turned out he couldn't be fired.
Right.
And I think because they actually had so succeeded in separating police from politics. At some point, police need to be accountable to the public, which happens through the political system. It's certainly better that way than happening just through the court system and the prosecutorial system. So I don't think we want to totally intertwine with politics, but I think we have to be realistic. Bratton, he was a good politician.
Mm-hmm.
As a police commissioner, like he understood the politics involved. So I think you need a little bit more of that. And yes, you want to be a little bit removed, but it's always going to be intertwined. So I think it's better to sort of.
What about the idea that big city police chiefs should be elected as opposed to appointed? Because then there is this inherent hierarchy that they have to agree with the mayor. They have to agree with the team that appointed them for their own professional career, as opposed to, we have people in various cities where the sheriff is very outspoken, but the police chief, very quiet.
Yeah. Sheriffs come to mind as elected officials. The problem when you elect the police commissioners, then you make it overtly about politics. I don't. Again, I could see this as hypocritical. I'm actually trying to, thread the needle here, where I understand it is political, but I like that step removed, so that the police commissioner can be appointed in theory based on competence, when that happens on a good day, and not simply running for office. I don't like the idea of elected sheriffs. I don't like the idea of elected prosecutors or judges either. Some of these things, I think I want a bunch of technocrats, some bipartisan committee to actually work together and pick people based on competence. So I would prefer to move in that direction. But there are pluses and minuses to it all. Certainly. You don't want a police commissioner who is a total flunky of the mayor. But on the other hand, an elect a different mayor, I guess, would be part of the answer.
Yeah.
I'd like to see a bit more stability. I was thinking one thing about elections, though, at least you're probably in there for 4 years. I don't think anyone can get the job done in just, with a few exceptions, but, can get the job done in a year or two. It's nice to know that you have a job for a while if you really want to do make changes for the better.
How do you talk to these officers now and say, look, gang, I know we're going through hills and valleys, and there was a time when everybody loved the cops, and 9/11 happened, and everybody
I was going to say for the 1 week after 9/11, when was that? Oh yes, okay.
Right. There was even a time out west, even during the 2020 era, when you'd have people come up and say, hey, just so you know, we appreciate you. Like we're not part of all that. And like you here.
Let's not also forget during COVID, we literally went from applauding police to throwing bottles at police overnight. There was, they were part of the heroic first responders until when was it, late March. Yeah.
If you let me, just so I remember in April when all this happened and everything just shut down, right? The world just sort of stopped. And I have a very profound story. I remember a little kid holding up a sign with like a blue heart. And I remember walking up to this particular house, and we put our hand on the window, and the family, everybody in mass, and they're like, thank you for being out there. Thank you. Thank you. Just like you said. And at 7:00, they would drive around with ambulances and fire trucks, and people would ring bells. And it felt like an hour passed, and I was standing on a line with people 8 inches away, despite all the COVID rules that we're supposed to have. For some reason, if you wanted to protest police, you were able to gather in groups of thousands together and shout at people inches away, thinking you're telling me you're a racist and I hope you die. And that juxtaposition in that short time is something I think I'll never be able to fully articulate. But when I say it to officers across the country, they inherently know what I'm talking about. It's almost like a PTSD moment.
And why? Because cops killed a man in Minnesota? Like, what? I mean, I have a lot of high-ranking officers who are my students here at John Jay College, and I'm thinking of one in particular who's, I don't want to say she's older, she's younger than me, but she's not a young cop, African-American woman, and she's like, if I hear one more white, she used a naughty word here, white girl who just moved to this city screaming at me that I'm racist. Like, I'm going to flip out.
Yeah.
And for what? Yeah. To what end? Well, it made policing worse. So yeah, in that sense, I will give COVID. I mean, I think that partly was just some weird pent up COVID release, or maybe, yeah, they're, I don't want to get too abstract and theoretic. I'm going to stop there on that one. But it was an amazing transformation. Let's leave it at that.
Yeah. I appreciate that take on it. So you're thinking leadership has to actually engage in that.
Oh, so
they
yeah,
have
what I
to
would
be
tell
leaders.
people, you have to be able to say I will defend you when you do a good job, even if it's controversial. They have to put their own ass on the line a little bit.
Yeah.
And then, I'm cribbing this from Louis Anemone, who would say, look, and talking about motivating cops, back in the 90s, but you came on this job for the right reason. You want to do good. You want to help people. You have to tap that somehow and say, we can still do that. And you can't let the bastards win, basically. There are people out there who, even when well-intentioned, sometimes not well-intentioned, there are people out there who are just anti-policing. Well, they're not the majority. Don't let that get you down. Focus on doing the right thing. Enjoy the satisfaction of, even if not saving the world, making one person's day a little bit better, of doing the right thing, and get back to that sort of the noble mission. I think it's important to keep that in mind. And I think for a very good reason, cops have to be reminded of that, because there are lots of things reminding them to give that up.
Yeah.
But this is not hard for leadership to do if they weren't so worried about whatever leadership is worried about these days. I don't know. I'm not a police leader, so
yeah. It's almost like we have to tell officers that are out there, and any that are listening, don't do what you know is right in spite of the lack of leadership, or in spite of the lack of internal support.
Yeah. But then if I see one more video where cops get in trouble for doing the right thing, it's a tougher sell today, is all I'm saying. But we still have to sell it that way, because what's the alternative? We give up, or you just, go in there and look at your phone for 8 hours and hide from everything. Like, that's, in the long run, that's not a sustainable way for a healthy life from the cop's perspective. You need job satisfaction, or you're going to be miserable for 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Professor, I want to be cognizant of your time, and I've had you for over an hour now, and we've covered a number of stuff. Is there anything your thoughts that may have came up that you wanted to discuss?
It's funny you think my time is precious. It's not. I could talk about this all day. Just for your sake and your listeners' sake, you don't want to go on too long. No, I mean, we could keep going if there's something else you want to bring up, but I'm pretty pleased with our discussion, which is why I love talking to you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, sir. That really means a lot to me. I still think it goes back to the Chicago roots. There's just a DNA thing that's there. And I wanted to say, every time I brought
what I just learned?
Oh,
that Italian beef is not a universal sandwich. I learned this last week. I'm 50 years old. And I was describing an Italian beef to somebody, because there's a place in Brooklyn that sells it. And she was like, what is it? I'm like, it's an Italian beef. She's like, what? And this went on. And I just could not comprehend that this was a Chicago term. And I've not lived in Chicago for 30 years. Anyway.
Oh, my goodness. Well, because I also am outside of the city, I've learned how to make it. So I will be more than happy to send you the crock pot recipe I use for one that is going to be almost as good as what we would get back home.
Yeah, do. I'd love to try it.
Yeah.
Because I always was a Polish sausage person more than an Italian beef person. But yeah.
I certainly will.
I'm sure everyone cares about Chicago cuisine who's listening. But anyway, they got to put up with it. This is our privilege.
Absolutely. Sir, I just want to say thank you so much. It's always such a great honor talking with you. We covered a lot. You mentioned so many names. I may just email you so I could put them in show notes. People like Jack Maple and Patty Baller from Chicago. I mean, there's so many names I had written down. Just if anybody wants a reference point, or maybe if you want to just give me a reading list or something that I can just share with folks. I think they might like it.
We'll figure something out.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much for your time and your insights. I know people have been asking about this, so they're going to be excited to hear this. It's going to be out in a few days. So thank you
both of them
so
who
much.
Have been asking about this. Come on now, let's not.
No, there's a few.
I don't know if it's been a great groundswell of
No, you're popular. At least in my little nook, you're popular.
I'll take it. I'll take it.
Thank you so much, and maybe we'll have you again in the near future if something else comes up.
Anytime. Thanks so much.
All right, Professor. Bye bye.